Is this some kind of joke? The guard's sharp voice sliced through the quiet morning air, heavy with irritation. He stood firm, arms folded across his chest, a human barrier in a neatly pressed uniform, blocking the grand gates of Arlington National Cemetery. Beside him, his partner, younger and just as smug, watched with a faint smirk. In front of them stood John Miller. At 87, his body was bent with age, his hands marked by time and his face traced with the deep lines of experience. He wore a plain dark suit, worn at the cuffs but clean and neatly pressed. It was the only one he owned. He didn't react to the guard's harsh tone. His calm eyes stayed fixed on the green hills beyond the gate, where flags fluttered at half-mast. He said nothing, his silence in stark contrast to the guard's hostility. The younger guard stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. "Sir, this is a private service for General Wallace, by invitation only. I need to see your credentials or you'll have to leave." The moment hung heavy in the air, a bitter note in a place meant for honor and remembrance. The guard saw only an elderly man, perhaps lost or confused, and failed to recognize the history standing before him, a man who embodied the very values this ground was meant to honor. Tension thickened as more cars began to arrive. Long, black sedans bearing government plates. Their passengers cast quick, curious glances at the old man being kept outside the gate. Still, John Miller waited. He had endured far worse in his lifetime. The guard, Jennings, sighed with exaggerated frustration. "Look, Grandpa, I don't have time for this. The motorcade will be here any minute, and you're becoming a security concern." He waved down the road. "If you're here to visit a grave, the public entrance is about a mile that way. Now, are you going to move or do we need to escort you out?" When John finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried weight, steady, measured, and full of quiet authority. "I'm here for the general," he said. "He would have wanted me here." The second guard, Corporal Davis, gave a short, dry laugh. "Right, you and the general am old friends, huh?" "With all due respect, sir, General Wallace was a 4-star. He advised presidents. He didn't exactly spend time with people who don't have an invitation." The insult was thinly veiled behind formal words. By now, a small group of mourners had gathered nearby, watching the standoff in uneasy silence, curiosity written on their faces. They stood as a solemn group of high-ranking officers, serious-faced politicians and grieving family members, all dressed in formal black. Their hushed murmurs created a quiet background beneath the guard's harsh voice. John could feel their eyes on him, a mix of pity, irritation, and discomfort. It was a feeling he knew well. He had spent much of his life being overlooked, underestimated, or simply unseen. Most days he didn't mind that. But not today, not in this place. "My name is John Miller," he said evenly. "Just tell them John Miller is here." Jennings stepped in closer, intentionally breaching his space to make a point. "John Miller, huh?" "Sure, and I'm the Secretary of Defense." His tone was mocking. "Names don't mean anything without the right paperwork, old man." He jabbed a gloved finger toward John's chest. "You've got no medals, no ribbons, nothing that proves you ever served. As far as I'm concerned, you're a civilian trespassing on federal property during a private event." The words carried weight. No proof of service. John's hand drifted instinctively to his side, where he could almost feel the ghost of things long left behind, symbols of duty and sacrifice he no longer wore. His proof wasn't made of metal or cloth. It was part of him now, written deep in his bones and memory. A young officer, a newly minted second lieutenant with a face far too young for the bars on his shoulders, approached from a nearby checkpoint, drawn by the rising tension. "What's the issue, Corporal?" he asked. "This man," Davis replied, motioning toward John, "refuses to leave. Claims to be a friend of General Wallace. No invitation, no credentials." The lieutenant looked John over from head to toe. His eyes paused on the old faded suit and worn shoes before making a quick, silent judgment. "Sir," he said, his tone clipped, "you are interrupting a state funeral. This is your final warning. Leave immediately." His voice carried forced authority, the kind that comes from practice, not experience. John's patience, at once deep and steady, had reached its limit. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly but firmly. The words were calm but firm. The lieutenant's face stiffened. "Then you're under arrest for trespassing and disrupting a military ceremony," he said flatly. He motioned toward the guards. "Escort him out." If he resists, restrain him. As Jennings and Davis moved to take hold of John's arms, the lieutenant noticed something pinned to the old man's lapel. A small, dull piece of metal, no larger than a dime, attached slightly off-center. It was bent, tarnished, and looked insignificant. The lieutenant smirked and flicked it with a finger. What's this supposed to be? A toy from a Cracker Jack box? The instant his finger brushed the metal, everything around them vanished. The manicured grounds of Arlington faded, replaced by the thick mud and relentless rain of a distant jungle. The clean air turned heavy with the sharp scent of blood and gunpowder. The quiet murmurs of mourners were replaced by the desperate cries of wounded soldiers. A young captain, his face smeared with dirt and fear, lay trapped beneath a fallen banyan tree. His leg was twisted at a terrible angle. That captain was David Wallace. With trembling, blood-covered hands, he held out a jagged, warm piece of metal to a much younger John Miller. "Take it, John," Wallace gasped through pain. "It's not regulation, it's not official, but it means more than any medal they'll ever make. It means you were there. It means you saved us." The vision shattered. John stood once more at the cemetery gate, sunlight glaring in his eyes. The lieutenant was still standing there, smirking, unaware of what had just passed. But something had changed in John's face. A quiet strength, long buried, sparked to life behind his eyes. He brushed the lieutenant's hand away from the pin. "Don't touch that," he said, his voice calm but edged with warning. The tension reached its breaking point. Encouraged by their officer, the guards gripped John's frail arms. The small crowd gasped, a collective shock at the public humiliation of a man whose only wish was to pay his respects to a friend. Yet, not everyone in the crowd remained silent. At the back stood a young Army captain named Hayes. He had watched the entire exchange with growing discomfort. After 2 tours overseas, he knew the look of someone who had seen real combat. That quiet, unshakable composure that no training could fake. He recognized it instantly in the old man. In the way he stood his ground, endured the insults without a word, and looked straight through the chaos as if he had seen far worse before. Something felt deeply wrong. When the guards laid hands on John, Captain Hayes knew he couldn't just stand and watch. Direct involvement wasn't an option. It would create a tangle of insubordination and procedural chaos that could end his career. But there was something he could do. He quietly slipped his phone from his pocket, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. He had a number, a direct line to Colonel Markinson, the man who had served as General Wallace's right hand for 2 decades. Stepping away from the crowd, Hayes turned his back to shield the call. "Sir, this is Captain Hayes," he said in a low, urgent tone. On the other end, the colonel's voice came through, brisk and distracted. "Hayes, what is it? We're 5 minutes from the procession. Is there an issue with the honor guard?" "No, sir," Hayes replied. "It's at the main gate. Security is holding an elderly man trying to enter." Markinson let out an audible sigh. "And this needs my attention because, why, let the guards deal with it. They have their instructions." "Yes, sir." But he claims he knew the general. He gave his name as John Miller. Hayes hesitated, then added the detail that had been bothering him since he first noticed it. "Sir, he's wearing a small tarnished pin on his lapel. It's misshapen. Looks like a piece of shrapnel." There was an instant of complete silence on the line. Not the kind that comes from poor reception, but the heavy stillness that says more than words ever could. All background noise from the command post, the soft radio static, the rustle of papers, distant chatter, faded into nothing. Hayes waited, barely breathing. When Colonel Markinson finally spoke again, his voice was different, steady, but weighted with something that hadn't been there before. The irritation in the colonel's voice was gone, replaced by a sudden urgency that made the hairs on Hayes's neck stand up. "Captain, repeat that name," he demanded. "Miller, sir. John Miller." The line went silent. Hayes looked up just in time to see the guards starting to pull the old man away from the gate toward a nearby security vehicle. He was too late. Inside a command tent roughly 100 yards from the ceremony, Colonel Markinson stared at his phone as if it had shocked him. His face turned pale as he slammed it down on the table. An aide, a young major, looked up, startled. "Sir, is everything okay?" "Get me General Peters," Markinson snapped, his tone sharp and controlled. "Contact him on the radio. Pull him off the reviewing stand if you have to. Just get him now." He began pacing the narrow space of the tent, running a hand through his hair as his thoughts raced. John Miller. For years, General Wallace had been searching for that man. In the final decade of his life, he had made every effort to find him, to thank him one last time. Markinson remembered the general's final letter, still locked in his desk drawer. In it were clear instructions. If a man named John Miller ever comes looking for me, give him whatever he asks. He is owed a debt this nation can never repay. The major returned, holding out a radio handset. "Sir, I have General Peters." Markinson snatched it immediately. "General, this is Markinson," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We have a code shepherd at the main gate." "I repeat, code shepherd is active." The radio hissed, then crackled to life with the voice of the highest-ranking officer present, 4-star General Michael Peters. All formality was gone from his tone. "Say again, Colonel?" "Shepherd, that's not possible." "It's him, sir." The description matches, the pin, the name. "It's John Miller, and security is currently detaining him." The response came instantly, cold and absolute. "Stop everything. Suspend the procession. I'm on my way." Back at the gate, the young lieutenant was savoring his perceived victory. Order had been restored. The disturbance removed. He leaned casually against a stone pillar, watching with satisfaction as his men restrained the old veteran. He decided to deliver one final insult to the man's dignity. Walking over to John, who stood quietly between the two guards, shoulders heavy, not from defeat but from deep, weary sadness, and the lieutenant leaned in close. His tone dripped with condescension. "Last chance, old man. You can walk away from here with what's left of your pride, or spend the rest of General Wallace's funeral in a holding cell. We'll charge you, and I'll personally recommend a full psychiatric evaluation. A man your age lost in his delusions. You're a danger to yourself and a public embarrassment." He paused, sneering. "You want to pay your respects? You can do it from behind bars while you try to remember your own name." That was his mistake, the act of arrogance that crossed an irreversible line. He had humiliated a man of honor, pushing far beyond what respect could bear. Then it began. A low, steady rumble, more felt than heard. It rolled through the quiet of Arlington, turning heads in every direction. Coming over the hill was a motorcade, 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans, their dark windows reflecting the morning sun. But they weren't moving with the slow formality of a funeral procession. They advanced with speed and unmistakable purpose, the urgency of a rapid response. The vehicles screeched to a halt just feet from the gate, scattering gravel. The lieutenant and his men froze, their hands still on John Miller. The doors opened in unison, precise and controlled. Outstepped not security, but 6 men in immaculate army dress blues, senior officers and decorated soldiers, their uniforms heavy with medals that clinked softly as they moved. Colonel Markinson emerged first, his face set in cold fury. Then the rear door of the lead vehicle opened. General Michael Peters stepped out, tall, commanding, the 4 silver stars on his shoulders glinting in the light. The air itself seemed to change. The soft wind, distant traffic, and low murmur of the crowd all faded to silence. Every eye turned toward the general, whose presence seemed to draw the very breath from the scene. A wave of dread passed over the lieutenant. He and his men instantly snapped to attention, hands falling away from John Miller as if he were untouchable. General Peters didn't so much as glance at them. His eyes, sharp and gray as storm clouds, moved across the scene until they found what he was searching for, the frail, stooped figure of John Miller. And in that instant, his entire demeanor shifted. The hardened authority melted into something else, a quiet, unmistakable respect. He began walking, each step deliberate, his polished boots striking a slow, steady rhythm. He passed the lieutenant, the guards, and the bystanders, his focus fixed on one man. Stopping exactly 3 feet before John Miller, the general straightened to his full height. In perfect silence, he raised his right hand in a crisp salute, not casual, not routine, but the sharpest, most precise gesture of respect any of those watching had ever seen. A 4-star general, saluting a civilian in a worn, faded suit. His voice, one that had once commanded armies and counseled presidents, carried across the grounds, clear and unwavering for all to hear. "Mr. Miller, it is an honor, sir." The lieutenant, completely stunned, finally managed to speak. "General, sir, I apologize for the disruption. This man, he was creating a scene. He had no authorization to be here." General Peters' head turned sharply toward the lieutenant. Without lowering his salute, his eyes locked onto the young officer with such intensity it felt like a physical impact. "He has more right to stand on this ground than you or I ever will." Lieutenant, then, without breaking his salute, he shifted his focus to the silent crowd gathered around them. His voice carried easily, deep, firm, and resonant, filled with both authority and weight. "For those who do not know," he began, "allow me to tell you who stands before you. You see an elderly man, a civilian perhaps, but I see a giant. This is John Miller. To most history books, that name means nothing. But to the men of the 5th Special Forces Group, to the first members of Delta, and to the man we honor today, General David Wallace, he was a legend. He was known by another name, the Shepherd." A ripple moved through the crowd, gasps, murmurs. The name was recognized like a story whispered through generations of soldiers. "This man," the general continued, his tone rising with conviction, "went into places that never existed on any official map, to rescue men already declared lost. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a medic, a pilot, a navigator, and when it became necessary, a warrior of unmatched resolve. He never wore rank, never accepted commission, and refused every medal offered to him. He once said the only reward he ever wanted was seeing his men return home alive." The general took a slow step toward John, emotion evident in his eyes. "In the spring of 1968, a helicopter carrying 12 Green Berets was shot down deep in enemy territory. Among the survivors was a young captain named David Wallace. For 3 days they were trapped, surrounded, outnumbered 10-1, and cut off from rescue. But on the 3rd night, one man came for them. Moving through the jungle and slipping past enemy patrols came the Shepherd. He carried half of those men out on his own back. John Miller, standing right here, is the reason David Wallace lived to become the great leader we honor today." Finally, the general lowered his salute but kept his eyes fixed on John. Then he gestured toward the small, tarnished pin on John's lapel. "You see this piece of metal, this so-called trinket you dismissed as junk?" His voice dropped into a low, cold tone directed at the lieutenant. "It's a fragment from a mortar shell that landed 3 feet from Captain Wallace." John Miller threw himself over him, taking the blast that would have ended Wallace's life. General Wallace himself forged that fragment into this pin. He named it the Medal of Shepherds. It's the only one that exists, and it represents the highest honor a man like him could give. The vindication was complete. The crowd's gaze shifted, no longer filled with pity but with reverence. Soldiers across the ranks, from privates to colonels, slowly began to raise their hands in salute to the unassuming old man before them. The lieutenant's face turned pale. His composure vanished as the realization set in. What he and his men had done was more than an error. It was a disgrace. General Peters finally turned his full attention to the lieutenant and his guards. His voice lowered to a calm, dangerous quiet, a tone far more intimidating than any shouted command. "You asked him for his invitation," the general began, his tone firm and deliberate. "Let me make something clear. Every single headstone on that hill is his invitation. Every flag lowered to half-mast is his personal welcome." He stepped closer, and the young officers instinctively tensed as though he had raised his hand. "You demanded to see his medals," the general continued. "Lieutenant, the scars on this man's body speak to a kind of courage your rulebook can't measure. His bravery is carried in his heart, not displayed on his chest. Your duty is security, but your most valuable tools are not your weapon or your radio. They are judgment and understanding, and in both you have failed on an extraordinary level. You stood in the presence of living history and saw only an inconvenience. You mistook a hero for a trespasser." His gaze stayed fixed, unwavering. "You will report to my aide, provide your names and units, and you will be in my Pentagon office at 600 hours tomorrow for a conversation about what true respect means. Is that understood?" "Yes, General," the 3 men replied quietly, their faces pale with embarrassment. Just as the general turned away, John Miller, who had remained silent throughout the entire scene, reached out and placed a weathered hand on the general's arm. "Michael," he said softly, using the general's first name, "they're just young men doing their job the only way they know how. Let it go." The general looked down at him, his expression softening. He nodded slowly, Then John turned toward the lieutenant. There was no anger in his eyes, only calm understanding. "Son," he said gently, "that uniform you wear doesn't grant you respect by itself. It's a symbol, a promise. Respect is something you earn every single day through the way you treat others. And remember this, some of the most important people, those who've sacrificed the most, may not wear a uniform at all. Keep that in mind." As John spoke, the memory of the pin's creation resurfaced, not as a chaotic flash, but as a vivid, solemn moment, a small field hospital, filled with the smell of antiseptic and loss. A young John Miller lay on a cot, his back torn by shrapnel wounds. Nearby sat Captain David Wallace, his leg wrapped in a splint. In his hand, Wallace held a jagged piece of metal taken from John's wounds just hours earlier. "They're putting me in for a Silver Star for that mission," Wallace said quietly, "but it belongs to you. I can't give you anything the Army will officially recognize, but I want you to have this. So neither of us forgets the cost or the debt." That was the true origin of the small, worn pin. A story of sacrifice and brotherhood forged in blood and loyalty. General Peters personally escorted John Miller through the gates, past rows of saluting soldiers and a silent crowd. He didn't place him at the back, but in the front row, beside General Wallace's grieving family. They knew of the shepherd, having grown up on stories of his courage. With tears in their eyes, they embraced the man who had given them 50 extra years with the person they loved. John sat quietly through the service, composed and reflective, paying his final respects to a fallen comrade, his last mission fulfilled. The aftermath of the gate incident was immediate and firm. The lieutenant and his guards were not dismissed in disgrace. John would never have wanted that. Instead, General Peters oversaw their reassignment and mandatory retraining. He also launched a new program for all military security personnel, one that emphasized awareness, history, and empathy. It trained soldiers to look beyond appearances, to recognize the person behind the uniform or the lack of one. The program became known throughout the armed forces as the Miller Protocol. The story of the old man at the gate soon became a lesson in humility, shared with every new recruit entering service. Months passed. Seasons changed. The young lieutenant, now humbler and wiser, was stationed at a quiet checkpoint on a distant base, far removed from Arlington's prestige. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He sat in a small roadside diner eating lunch and stirring his coffee when the doorbell chimed. An older man in a plain jacket walked in, shaking off the rain, and took a seat at the counter. It was John Miller. The officer's chest tightened. He watched as John ordered coffee, his eyes fixed on the window, lost in thought. After a long pause, the officer stood, walked over, and placed a $10 bill beside John's cup. John looked up, recognition flickering in his calm eyes. "For the coffee, sir," the officer said quietly. Then after a moment he added, "And for the lesson, thank you." John studied him for a moment, noticing the humility that had replaced arrogance. He smiled faintly and nodded. "Stay safe, son," he said softly, a quiet blessing. The young officer nodded and left the diner, leaving John Miller to his coffee, a silent understanding shared between two men. John Miller's story reminds us that true heroes often carry their greatness quietly. If this story of humble valor inspired you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of the quiet heroes who walk among us.